So, in previous episodes, we have talked about inclusive design for learning, and today we want to talk about actually implementing IDL. Can you start, Gina, by giving us a context for how we are going to achieve this?
Sure. So I think it's important to start with sort of a big picture context before thinking about designing our instruction. So, and when we first kind of introduced this idea of inclusive design for learning, we had this river of motivation. And that river is sort of moving towards our goals, right? If you imagine that the coffee cup is the goals. And we really want to make sure that we're bringing the teacher's goals and students' goals together, right, as much as possible. Because if those are far apart, we're going to lose sort of all our motivational drive and power. We want to make sure that we share those goals a little bit. It's difficult, but it's worth the effort. The other sort of important part of that contextualization is this hill beneath the river of motivation, right? So if the hill goes up, does the river go faster or slower?
The river goes faster.
Right. So a really kind of positive way to frame this hill is curiosity. We want to tap into everybody's diverse interests and backgrounds and make sure that everybody is sort of into and engaged in this learning, right? So that they feel motivated to kind of actively participate in that. And so once we have kind of this frame, this kind of river of motivation, fun metaphor, then we can start thinking about designing our boat of instruction, and doing that in a way that's inclusive and effective for as many people as possible.
And what about if the banks are far apart, the student goals are way over here and the teacher's goals are way over here, what does that do to?
I mean, in that case, right, when a river spreads out, we lose all our power, right? All that generative potential just gets spread out. We really want to bring those together as much as possible. And in order to do that, we have to listen to students. We have to find out what they think is interesting and matters to them in their context and their time.
So can you describe the process by which implementation of inclusive design, what are the first steps?
So I really like to start with thinking about goals, right? Because that's hopefully where we're headed. So really the first thing to do is to identify clear, specific goals. And now we can have big kind of umbrella goals. So for the Inclusive Design for Learning course, that overarching goal is working with students to develop knowledge and skills for more effectively engaging diverse learners. But then, that's sort of the overarching big picture. We want to break that down into landmarks on the way to reaching that, into more specific kind of steps or landmarks that begin to move from the sort of more abstract understanding to more specific, tangible accomplishments. And then so once we begin to do that, right, so once we sort of break these overarching goals into smaller landmark goals, we can start seeing how these tangible things could feed into thinking about our assessments and strong emphasis there on formative assessments. We have to do some summative assessments, but really it's those formative assessments and using those in a way that both improves our own instruction, right, and facilitates students in their metacognition or awareness of how much they're learning. So really, making sure that those are useful in enhancing student learning.
So having decided on goals and appropriate assessments, what happens next?
Well,
in this process.
And this is kind of something called backwards design, which has been around for quite a while. But once we have kind of our goals and our assessments, and our kind of landmark assessments, whether those are really informal, just a conversation, or more formal, like a minute paper or a quiz or even an essay or a project, then we move on to really thinking about designing our boat. And do you remember what the boat is?
The boat of instruction.
Yeah, what does that consist of? So we have kind of our representations, how are things represented, how are things acted on or expressed, and how are people engaged in between. And very importantly, in inclusive design for learning, we have this adaptability piece. So we want to make sure that this is flexible and not kind of overly clunky or overly rigid and constrained, that it's adaptable to change because stuff changes.
So we're able to assess student learning and see what they're getting, see what they're not getting, and make accommodations and adaptations to fit those learning needs.
Exactly, but not just student learning, our own instruction as well. It's
right.
a two-sided thing. And so, when we begin to think about designing our instruction in this way, it's really easy to start to go from those assessments and start thinking about ways of acting or expressing on what we know, and providing sort of a diverse means of doing those things. So not just one way of knowing what students know, and not just one way of representing stuff, right? So I like to go from assessments to expressions and then kind of jump to representations. But what we really want is this magical engagement piece that emerges in between those two. And that's really a function of how we kind of structure our activities and dialogue in the classroom in a way that builds on sort of emergent student engagement. So instead of just me kind of addressing this whole huge class of people, I really want to help them break into smaller groups where they're more comfortable and then build that up.
And we will talk about this a little bit when we talk to one of the former Inclusive Design for Learning students who has been teaching for a couple of semesters, trying to implement some of this course design about the traditional lecture format and student attentiveness, and how you tend to lose people after about 20 minutes of just lecturing at them rather than engaging with them.
That comes from kind of a misconception about learning, which is it doesn't happen with just me controlling everything, right? It happens with us working together, right, to develop this understanding. And that's much more effectively done, right, when building on local interactions and sort of cooperating at lower levels and making sure that we're building on that instead of me just trying to control the whole classroom. And that way students have a voice, right, even if it's in a smaller group at some point, in that larger picture, and they're not just sort of passively taking in this information. And I think it's really important here to remind everybody how important alignment is. So we talked about a little bit aligning teacher and student goals, but we also want to emphasize that aligning goals with assessments and aligning those assessments with the rest of our instructional design is really important. And we have all these great principles, right? Kind of that equitability, central principles, and all the other ones that feed into that. So those can really help in having a sort of flexible rubric to look back to and say, am I kind of aligning with this idea of perceptibility or this idea of having tolerance for error, et cetera, et cetera.
And David definitely talks about that, and maybe we'll comment on that after we see what he has to say.
Great.
So this is David. He took the Inclusive Design for Learning class about a year ago, right?
2 semesters, yeah.
2 semesters ago, yeah. And so he's been teaching, what's the course you teach?
I teach a course called Semiconductor Physics and Devices. It's EC 3610, not that the number matters.
And so you've been trying to implement the Inclusive Design for Learning principles and guidelines into your teaching. So tell us a little bit about what you've been doing.
Right. Well, of course, the inclusive design part comes into play in several areas of what I'm doing. But the overarching principle of the method in which I teach by is called TBL, Team-Based Learning, which is very similar to a class flip. Mm-hmm. Yeah. In that, what I mean is traditional lecture, right, you do lecturing to the students in the class, and then you turn around and you give them homework, and they go home and they do their homework, and then they bring their homework back, and you lecture to them more, and that cycle continues. And what is shown in the literature is that traditional lecture, you have an incredible drop-off of attentiveness during the classroom, and the numbers that I know are 20 minutes, 50% of your students will be inattentive, or at least 50% less learning is going on after 20 minutes. And so there's a couple of things you could do. You could change up everything every 20 minutes, or what is shown to be even more beneficial to the students as far as acquisition of knowledge is to get them working together, make the classroom active, and get them working in groups, and they work on problems while you're there. And
a more collaborative learning
it's
environment.
a collaborative learning environment. So what I do is, instead of lecturing to them, I have them go home. I assign a reading. That reading is usually just 1 or 2 sections out of each chapter. They can read that. And in order to incorporate some inclusive design principles, I also have a couple of other things that they can do to learn the material. They can do a reading guide. So I write up a reading guide. I try to incorporate some principles about how that's written electronically, so that if somebody who couldn't see it needed to have it read to them, that it should read out loud correctly. And at times, especially for difficult material, I will do a video lecture that they can watch. I try to keep the video lectures 5 minutes, 10 minutes at the max.
So I thought of something so making that information perceptible
Yes.
through the electronic format, so that it is able to be read properly by a screen reader.
Right.
Perceptible.
Yeah. And, some of the simple things are like, instead of using the titles for, the word formatting, or even just formatting it yourself, you use the header format. So anytime that the format is done in a way that's consistent with HTML design, I think you should talk about this if you haven't already. That's how you do that. Use the headers.
I've seen that, and I took a course on creating accessible PDFs,
Right.
and they talk about in Word there's labels
Right.
that you can use, heading,
Right.
subtext, different things like that.
Yes.
So that's what you're talking
That's
about.
what I'm talking
Yeah.
about. So that covers kind of what we do outside of the classroom. So they have a reading. They have other forms that they can get the material, reading guides, video lectures, and they come prepared to class. And so in order to incentivize them, give them incentive to come to class prepared, they are assigned a reading assessment. And it's a simple, non-pressure assessment of whether they did the reading or not. So it's on Blackboard is what the technology that I use right now, because that's what we have on campus. But they log on to Blackboard, they take a couple of questions and they answer them, and it's over the material. And they submit those questions, and I grade those questions based on their effort, not based on their quality of their information, because I want to see how well they learned it, where they're struggling, and if they have any issues with it. And I also want to encourage them, of course, to do the reading. The third question that I always have is simply that: what did you find the most difficult? And that way I'm getting feedback, and I can spend time during my lecture on things that are most important to them, based on what they don't know,
So you
or
can
what they've struggled with.
address some of those misconceptions.
Right.
Before
And I
class
don't have to come up with those misconceptions myself. I've learned what those misconceptions are
Right.
based on what they have told me. So usually during lecture, that's the first thing that I will do, is take a couple of minutes to discuss what it is that I figure out that they have problems with, and that's unfortunately a traditional lecture. If I have time, I'll prepare something ahead of time that's a little bit collaborative, but I do spend a few moments talking to them about the things that they struggle with, explaining it to them, or working on a problem for them. Then we spend the rest of the time doing team-based assignments. And for my classes, it's mostly math. It's mostly, can you do the math? Can you plug the numbers in the right way? And can you get the right solution? And so for me, I give them problems that they just have to work out in class. To their groups. Their groups are comprised of 4 to 5 students. I could talk a lot about groups, but probably for another time. And how we formulate groups, but essentially the groups are diverse, and it gives them the best opportunity, hopefully, to learn from each other. And they work on those assignments in the class, and the advantage there that I see is that they're doing homework essentially in class,
Right.
but they're not doing it alone. They're doing it with their peers, and they're also doing it with me involved, and that way I can go around and I can see if they have any issues. I can address those issues. And I can interact with them when I feel it's appropriate. to enhance their learning.
And you call that just-in-time teaching.
The just-in-time teaching part comes into play when they have a problem, right? So if in one group I see a problem, I can address that problem with them right there, just in time, right?
Yeah.
One thing that also is incorporated in just-in-time teaching is if I see the common problem throughout the groups, or I see common problems throughout the groups, then I can say, okay, the entire class, pay attention for a second, and I will do a lecture, again, try to keep it short, a couple minutes, on what it is that they're having problems with, to everybody. Yep.
And then we talked about this, I don't know if we've mentioned it in a previous video, but the two-stage exams. And so last semester you were trying that with your class. And what kind of advantages and disadvantages did you see with that?
Well, let me first explain the philosophy of why you would want to do a two-stage exam, at least from my perspective.
Okay.
We're spending the entire classroom working in groups, right? I mean, it should be pretty obvious that what we are trying to incorporate is learning in the collaborative environment. Why would you then, since your entire period is spent working in groups and not individually, why then would you turn around and say, well, in this exam, it's just you, right? So we want to incorporate this idea of the group work and the group collaboration into the exam stage. Of course, I still need to understand, and I still need to know what each individual student understands. So I still have to have some component that is individual exam. But the idea is to take the material that they've learned, give an exam, turn around in the same period, and give that same exam back to them in groups. And I think it works really well, and it definitely incorporates the principles. You mentioned I banded it this semester. That's more a technicality than anything.
Yes.
So for me, my assigned class is Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 50 minutes, and that leaves me either 25 to 30 minutes to give the first exam, time to turn it around and hand out the next exam, and then that leaves them maybe 20 minutes at max, maybe not even that.
And in a heavy math course, it's something that's taken.
Right.
It just does not fit in with that time constraint, because we're constrained by that time.
I'm constrained by the time that I have with the students, and so there's two things that I could see that would be a solution to that, because I still believe in the principles of the two-stage exam, but the problem was logistical, right? So I would either need to be able to schedule time outside of the class period with each of the students, or schedule the classes so that it's like Tuesday, Thursday, and maybe I have an hour and 20 minutes with them, or an hour and 30 minutes with them, and that way that would give me just enough time to incorporate the two-stage exam process in a way that works for a math-heavy class. Another way that I also incorporate, and there's other benefits to this too that I'll talk about, is to take the exam schedules and have more exams throughout the semester. So you have less material that you need to cover per exam. And of course then if you have less material to cover, then you can get through it in a short amount of time during the exam. And so that could be a possible benefit to the two-stage exam process. But there's an added benefit to doing multiple exams throughout the semester. You have less material to learn, but you accumulate that material every time you take an assessment, an exam. And so you take the time as a student then to put all those things together in your head and to learn it and to try to summarize in your head, and you practice the problems, and then you take your exam. Well, the more often that you summarize that and reflect upon the material, the better you're going to learn it. I mean, that should be obvious, but research also shows that. And so it's beneficial not only to have shorter cycles between exams, more work for us, more work for you, but as a teacher, but it is beneficial to the students.
The learning is improved.
The learning is improved.
And so what do you do this semester with your assessments?
Well, the talking about the multiple exams throughout the semester is what I've done this semester.
Okay.
Last semester, I did the 2-6 exams, and I had the material split up into 3 parts. This semester, I have it designed, of course, not the end of the semester yet, but I have it designed so that I'll do 4 exams throughout the semester.
So just adding that one extra one allows you to have
right,
less time
and ideally maybe even 5. Exams throughout the semester. But I've extended it. Of course, this is always an evolution rather than a complete overhaul, right?
Yeah.
So
I think that's all we've got.
All right.
So, and hopefully you're going to be able to record a integrity video or screen capture of some of the things that you do that he does in Blackboard to use that.
Yeah, so rather than just talk about, what is this reading guide thing and what is this Blackboard thing,
we'll show you.
you.
Hopefully.
Okay.
Okay, great. So, Jessie Merriman, one of my fabulous students and teachers, I have a few questions for you about inclusive design for learning implementation, and we can just sort of talk our way through these. So, the first thing to really think about is what are the major constraints or struggles that you have in implementing inclusive design for learning?
Probably the biggest struggle is being prepared ahead of time. Having the resources to actually do the things that you want to do and you have in your head that you know you want to do, but being organized ahead of time and knowing a structure and being able to anticipate things that don't go well, things like that. So
great. Well, not great that happens, but that's, I think, definitely a major struggle for all of us is to have somewhat of a structure.
Yeah, and I feel like it's more important in this sort of context because if you go to traditional lecturing, it's fairly easy to just take old PowerPoints or whatever
Just
and
kind of perpetuate that.
Yeah, and
right?
it's like I said, it's very easy to just sit around or just stand in front of the chalkboard and talk about geology for hours. I can do that. Have no problems whatsoever. But engaging the students into talking with each other about geology is one of the bigger challenges, and it takes a lot of planning, I think, or at least a plan ahead of time in order to do that.
Absolutely. Other constraints.
There's a little bit of financial constraints. It's not huge, but I always, if I have a good idea for a lab, I think about all these different ways I can approach it, and then I'm thinking, well, am I going to have to buy these supplies myself? Am I going to have to prep all this and practice this on myself?
Very little red herring,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. So I mean, sometimes that limits you. Part of it too is just me having too much of an imagination and wanting to do huge things.
I can relate.
Yes.
And I think that recognizing some of those institutional constraints, financial constraints, in addition to that difficulty with managing time and priorities is really important. And often we need that imagination in order to make the most of sort of our existing structures and do what we can do when we can do it in our contexts. Sometimes it's just a few simple little steps in the right direction. The action paralysis we talked about, where there's so much that we want to change and improve, right, that we don't even know where to begin implementation. So I think that's great you recognize that.
Yeah.
Anything else there in that kind of constraints box?
No, I think I kind of, for the summer, I kind of dived into the swimming pool, partially by not ordering a lab textbook, which it basically
That
just
sort of makes you
constrains me
accountable,
or makes me
yeah.
accountable for actually doing everything. So I committed early into really changing things, because now I have no choice unless I want to buy all my students a lab
Right,
textbook.
and sometimes that accountability, holding yourself accountable and
Yeah.
holding each other accountable is really good, because that helps us in sort of making sure that we work together to make it happen. And so that's good. I think it's wonderful to recognize some of those challenges before we think about, okay, so realistically, what helps you with implementation? Some of the top most facilitating factors.
Having a community around you that can help you is probably the biggest thing. Being able to bounce ideas off of people, and then if you don't have answers for something, if you don't know how to if you have something that you want to do but you're not quite sure how to do it, being able to ask people and ask for help.
Have to understand and know how to do everything. We just
Yeah.
have to understand and know people who know other things
Yeah.
different than we do, right?
And that's actually one of the more stimulating things, is like being able to share ideas with other people and actually see them get excited about them and come up with other ideas, and things tend to multiply and you get bigger ideas or more concrete ideas where you can actually apply things.
Yeah, and bring them to life.
Yes.
Great. Anything else you want to add there?
No.
That was beautiful. Thanks so much.
Okay, so let's start with simple things that can be done by anyone in pretty much any classroom to immediately make things a little bit more accessible, a little bit more inclusive to everybody in the classroom. So, for example, a lot of the teaching that I do is still based around PowerPoint. I have slides, tend to be heavy on the visuals. I make a very conscious effort to go light on the words. And if you're not already with the things that Edward Tufte writes in his writings about PowerPoint, they're a really good thing to reinforce, to not overcrowd PowerPoints, to put as little on there as possible. Less is more. Anyway, when I'm presenting graphs or figures, and sometimes it's even photographs, since I deal with geology and we often have photographs of just landscape, the most important thing is to describe what is there, to give a verbal representation as well as a visual. And of course, directly that's going to help anyone who is visually impaired. And in the last couple of years, I've started wearing glasses. I've started to appreciate much more, especially from the back of a room, how difficult it can be to get a really clear view of an image on the screen. But also, even for the students who have excellent vision, they still don't see the graph. They don't read a graph or read a landscape in the same way that I do. And so providing the verbal explanation along with the visual is a really good way of reinforcing what they're learning and helping for everybody to grasp what the point is. More on graphs and figures that I produce or that I use in class. I make a very conscious effort these days to use different symbols as well as different colors. If I have just 4 different lines on a graph, I'll make sure that they're different colors, and then some are dotted, some are dashed, one's a solid line. Because color blindness affects a lot of men in particular, but it's in a room full of 30 people or 300 people, you're very likely to have a few, or in the case of the large room, a few dozen who have some degree of color blindness. So either using different symbols with the different colors, different line styles. Another thing in my geology classes, something that I've tried to do anyway, but now I see more of an underlying purpose, and it's really prompted me to try to do it more often, is to pass around a rock as I'm talking about rocks. And this helps to reinforce for kinesthetic learners that they get more of a connection if I'm talking about something, not just showing a picture on the screen, but also being able to actually touch it, be hands-on and tactile with it. So I've been trying to do that more often as well. In different classes, different subjects, that may be easier or harder to do. Okay, so that's 3 simple things. Basically, verbal description, being more careful with visuals, and providing some kind of physical thing for students to interact with as I'm speaking. I want to give a small case study because, again, focused on geology, we do field trips. Not very often. We're in Missouri. It's a long way to any rocks that I find particularly exciting. But we do have a long weekend field trip every spring to a corner of southeast Missouri that does have some lovely old volcanic rocks. And it's a very scenic area. Everybody enjoys that field trip. So this year I was really noticing, partly through having sat in the IDL class last semester and being prompted to think about these things more often. But again, when we get to an outcrop and the students will look at the rocks that are there, and I was really surprised by how reluctant they were to engage with the rocks and be really hands-on. Whereas a couple of years ago, when we had a visually impaired student who came along with us, and she was very hands-on with any rock we encountered. That was the first thing, was to put hands on it, feel the texture, is it rough, is it smooth, really try to approach the rock in that way. And the students who were sighted were not doing that. more interestingly, the students who were sighted were also not really walking up to the rocks and looking closely with their eyes either. They were observing from a distance. So we had to encourage them all to get the nose up against the outcrop and really use as many senses as possible. Again, while debriefing an outcrop, making sure that everybody had some idea of what we'd gone there to look at, was very careful to use, to describe things as carefully as possible verbally. So lots and lots of description to go along with the visuals, and of course the hands-on is there if they want it. Again, there is one outcrop we go to. It's in a state park where there is actually a Braille trail, which has a roped walkway, and then every few tens of yards there's a little a stop, which is kind of signaled by a bit of green carpet on the ground, and there's a little sign with both words and Braille explaining what that particular stop is for. And again, the same student has come on a few different field trips with me now. She's of course very happy to find that there is actually a bit of Braille out there describing things. We're lucky to have that, and it's only in the one state park, but it is pretty cool. Okay, third thing that I want to talk about then is barriers. So I've mentioned a few simple things that can be done that I have done. They really required no extra investment of time or effort on my part, except for remembering, consciously prompting myself to actually try to do these things in class. So, what is the biggest barrier to really going a lot further with this and really redeveloping a course with IDL as some of the core principles? And of course, the single biggest barrier as a faculty member is time. In cases where, for example, our summer intro class, that is commonly taught by a graduate student. We'll have a graduate student teaching it this summer who's taken the IDL class, and he's planning to completely overhaul that course. But it's a small course. It's only going to have probably of the order of 12 to 15 students enrolled, and that's all he does for the summer semester for 8 weeks. They meet every day for at least an hour of lecture, and then every other day for 2 hours of lab, so it's fairly intensive. But there's nothing else. There's no additional classes. Obviously, he is a grad student. He's not taking any courses over the summer. He's not teaching, supervising grad students, in charge of a lab, etc., etc. So that's a great opportunity, and hopefully when he's done that, he will share that with other people. So aside from time, of course, there are resources as well. So it would be nice to have fantastic 3D models of things that everyone could interact with. I have rocks, so that's great. What about if you have a map or some other diagram and you'd like to make a tactile version of that? There are one thing we learned about in the IDL class was all the many different technologies for making different tactile diagrams. There are some resources on our campus to do that. I've not investigated that largely through lack of time. And then finally, a thought for the future, something that I think will actually help with this will be the rapidly decreasing cost and increasing availability of 3D printers. So I can imagine in the future that that will be a fairly easy, once we learn how to actually use the 3D printer, but a relatively low cost in both money and time of making 3D representations of things. Again, providing kinesthetic learners with something tactile as well, which should help everyone.
So we've been talking about implementing inclusive design and how important it is to have multiple representations of things. It brought to mind one of my favorite movies of all time. Growing up as a kid, I loved Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And I think there's a really nice example of multiple representations and how important that can be. So for people who've never seen the movie, the premise of the movie is that lots of people start seeing UFOs, they're being visited by aliens, And if they've seen these things, they start to get images of something, but they don't know what it is, and they start making art. They start drawing pictures of Devil's Tower, which is actually the first national monument. You can see a pretty nice image of it here with the Milky Way in the background. So we start doing these pictures. We focus on Roy Neary, who is the main character. And the first thing he does is he does it with shaving foam on his hand. And then the classic scene that most people remember is him sculpting it out of mashed potato. And then a little later on, we see that he's not the only one doing it. Other people are doing this, and the woman that he's met along the way, Gillian, she's also making representations of it. But hers are pictures, very pretty pictures, that you can see right here. But he's continuing to refine his models, and so he's building them. He's got a train set, so he's building out his modeling stuff for that, and he's getting better and better at it until eventually he's built a huge one in the middle of his living room out of all sorts of stuff he found in the garden, and then he sees an image of the real thing, Devil's Tower, on the TV and realizes he has to go there. Now, the interesting thing about this is that there are all these people, and they all get called. They've all got this image in their head. They all go out to Devil's Tower, but most of them have only been drawing pictures, not making 3D representations. So eventually they get out there to where whatever is going on, and here we see a blurry image of them trying to scale the side of Devil's Tower because they want to get around the other side to see what's going on. And Roy Neary is the only one who knows what the terrain is like, that there's a sheer drop on the other side, because he's the one who built it in 3 dimensions, whereas everybody else had just done a 2D image of one side of it. And so this is a really nice example, I think, of multiple representations and how we can all learn something by thinking and representing something in 3D rather than 2D.
Anytime you're ready.
We've heard from a few people now, speaking about their experiences implementing IDL, as well as barriers and outcomes of their implementation and their design. Gina, could you expand a little based on the previous examples of implementation?
Absolutely, and I think that we heard some really good concrete examples from various contexts, and that really helps bring some of these ideals to life in various settings. Something I think is really important is that, great, we've designed all this, we have all these cool ideas, but we have to actually try it out, and we have to be prepared for this messiness of reality, right? And remembering that tolerance for error, not being afraid to screw up and learn from those mistakes in our implementation.
And we know some of those ideas might not work the first time around, and they have
Absolutely.
to be reimagined and looked at in a different way to see how that fits within our course design and within what our course material is covering.
Exactly. And in doing that, we have to be consciously aware of what's working and not working. And we can't do that all by ourselves often. We need different perspectives on that to sort of keep track of and reflect on, what are the constraints and what we're doing, and what are some of the really facilitating driving factors, and how do we use that understanding to improve not only our instruction, right, but most importantly, student learning.
So feedback, both internal feedback, reflection, feedback from our peers, and feedback from our students.
Yes, and then we get sort of this iterative improvement of both our design and practice, which is wonderful.